Alia is going to present on document accessibility, PhD candidate at Drexel. Thanks so much for putting this together and for sharing all your insights with us. If you have any questions, you can just feel free to unmute yourself and chime in, and then we can have Q&A at the end too, and we'll go from there. You can put them in the chat as well. I'll keep an eye on the chat for you. So, yay. Welcome, Alia. Take it away.
Woo! Welcome to document accessibility. If it looks like I'm looking at the wrong screen, it's because I have you on two screens. So I apologize in advance. And if my dogs do anything inappropriate, again, nothing I can do about it. So I apologize in advance. They like to cheer me on. So again, this is document accessibility. So the overview essentially is divided into three things of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to look at document content, how to structure the document, and how to assess accessibility to make sure that it meets all the metrics that we're looking for. And so document accessibility is important because people that have disabilities and people that may be impacted by inaccessible documents and have disabilities struggle when they don't have access to that stuff. It kind of bridges the learning. It kind of like extends the learning gap a little bit more. And so people that would struggle with the lack of accessibility when it comes to documents would be people with visual disabilities, auditory disabilities, motor disabilities that impact their ability to use a computer, as well as learning disabilities and cognitive disabilities. So with that in mind, it's important to keep in mind that accessibility is a continuum. And because people with disabilities are so varied, you can't really think of accessibility in terms of an absolute because it's not. And because things are not either accessible or not. Some things are sometimes accessible and other things are not always accessible. And so we have to work towards making sure that we're closer to the accessible, because when more things are accessible, then more people have access. So again, in that regard, this is where the continuum comes in. And so it kind of goes back a little bit to usability and just how easy it is to use something and just make it more accessible and all that fun stuff. And so while accessibility is part of a process that is continuous and iterative, there are certain ways that certain things that we have to like work towards to make sure that we meet the minimum criteria at minimum, because even the minimum criteria is not really enough to ensure that everyone has access to everything that they need. And so that's going to kind of lead us into a bunch of different things. And then there's a certain point where I'm going to pause a little and get in more in depth into a specific thing. That's going to be a little confusing sometimes because I know it was confusing for me, but it's really important, especially when we're working with images and things like that. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the content of the document itself. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are images, right? When we have images, we have alternative text, we have sometimes complex images, and we have to be mindful of where we position the images themselves. So alternative text is really, really important, and we have to ask ourselves specific things, especially when we're adding the alternative text, right? So we want it to be effective. So how do we make sure that it's effective? Well, we have to ask ourselves, what does this image represent, right? And if this image is a hyperlink, we have to ask ourselves, what is that image? What is that function of the image, right? So that whenever we're writing what the hyperlink is, what the alt text is, then it's effective and concise. So essentially, alternative text has to be succinct. It should not duplicate something that's already in the text nearby. Like if it says like the figure below represents like this, this, and this, then you shouldn't have that same thing written as your alternative text, because then the screen reader will read it twice, and that becomes confusing. When we're writing an alternative text piece, we have to also make sure we don't say this image of or graphic of or things like that, because screen readers already say that, so they'll automatically say this is an image of, and then if you write an image of, it's going to be this is an image of, right? Which is also not something. Yes.
Can I just ask a clarifying question of alt text? Is that like a caption, or like that's like what you would include at the bottom of a figure or something, or?
No, that's when you have an image and you add the alternative text, because if someone has a visual impairment, they can't see the image. And so the screen reader will read the alternative text instead that describes the image.
Sure. Okay,
So
thank
it's
you.
not like the heading of it. It's the alternative text to those who
Isn't
don't
that
have access to it.
the caption that shows up when you like hover your like mouse over it?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
thank
so
you.
like that's why it's really important, because if you're someone that has some kind of visual disability or low vision or color blindness, you kind of need that to kind of as a supplement. Since you cannot see the image, then the screen reader will tell you what that image is and will describe it for you. Um, Word and PowerPoint and like just Microsoft tools in general will sometimes generate automatic descriptions, and those are generally very, very poor quality. So avoid them unless they're really great, generally just really rare. So it's best to come up with your own, because you know more what that image is representing in the context that you're using it in. So it's best that you come up with your own alternative text instead of using a generated description. Another important piece that we tend to forget about when we're doing this is we sometimes have images that are decorative. And those don't need an alternative text, but if we don't mark them as decorative, then they're gonna kind of mess up the screen reader, and they're gonna make it look like your document is not accessible. So what I did was I have a lot of decorative images here in this PowerPoint, so I left them as that so that when we go through it, we'll kind of see what that makes it look like and how it negatively impacts the document's accessibility. Now, complex images are generally images that represent a large amount of visual information and require a lot of alternative text. Uh, and because it's a complex image, the amount of text that is required in the description for it is generally more than what is deemed acceptable in an alternative text description field. Okay, so in these cases, there are two ways that are recommended to make that complex image accessible. One is to have a narrative leading up to it, explaining it in the text, or a data table. So for example, if you have like a bar graph of like student test scores, like comparing them, that would be a complex image because it's multiple students. So you can either like write that out in your narrative and have that just be like a just a description, like that figure be kind of like a visual representation of that, so that the screen reader reads the text and then that's connected to the figure itself. Or you can alternatively also add a data table so that then the data is more easily represented for someone using a screen reader. Okay. Um, which brings us to, where do we position images? Because that's important. Because images in Word and document must be positioned in a specific way so that they're accessible. And this is because screen readers only recognize images that are wrapped in line with the text. So if it's a square or below or above or anything else, screen readers do not see it. It has to be in line with text, which goes against what a lot of us do because we like to make our things look pretty, and sometimes in line with text does not let us do that. So that has been one of the one issue that people struggle with. Like, I work with people who often want to keep their document as it is, and then we have a separate alternative document that's formatted specifically to be much more accessible, just because they want certain formatting things to look a specific way. All right, so it's double the work, but it still gets the job done. When you are, do I have any questions about images?
So is this mostly like if you're using Microsoft Word, or could you be using other software?
Yeah. It's applicable to all things. accessibility doesn't change depending on the software you're using. It just changes how you check it, right? Um, but yeah, accessibility is something that's just constant throughout everything. The second piece that we have here is hyperlinks. Hyperlinks obviously need to be accessible. So we're going to talk about how to make them accessible and how to add and edit the hyperlinks, which I assume people already have an idea of how to do it. And I know there was a question about that in the registration form. So essentially, a hyperlink text is a linked text that is linking to a website or a picture or whatever else that you have, or an email address or whatever else, because there are multiple things that we can hyperlink. There are four guidelines that we have when we're working with hyperlinks. It has to be descriptive, it has to be concise, it has to be unique, and it has to be visually distinct. All right, so by that I mean, by descriptive, I mean the link text should clearly describe the function of the hyperlink and not be the link itself. Because the screen reader software is then going to read the actual hyperlink if you link that as the text. And then when you put, it would be like www// so it becomes really like frustrating for the person who's listening to it because it's out of context. Whereas if you're actually name it as something of what it's going to be like linking to, then it makes a lot more sense, because screen reader software users may use it to navigate link by link or access the different links in the document as well. So it also kind of functions a little bit as like a search navigation piece sometimes, depending on how it's being used. So instead of saying like here's a link to an image of Maslow's hierarchy, right, and then linking the actual link, I would highlight Maslow's hierarchy and link that so that they know when they click on Maslow's hierarchy, they're going to that page or that image, right? Concise, the link text should be concise, brief but comprehensive. A very long link might be difficult to understand when it's being seen or heard, right? So just concise, descriptive, to the point. It has to be unique, because if we have two or more links with the same text, then the person listening to it is confused and they don't know which is which. So if they want to refer back and you just kept like and you just link web page, for example, and you have like web page for like different pieces, then they don't know which web page they're going to based on the name of it. But if you specify like the writing and literacy SIG web page, so you would like hyperlink writing and literacies, and then the other one would be like the ARA webpage. That way they know exactly which webpage they're going to, and not just kind of being like webpage, right? And that's a mistake that we all make because we don't realize, because we don't think with as screen readers. And so it's one of those things that you don't really consider until it's pointed out to you. It also has to be visually distinct. It's important that people who, whether or not you have a visual disability, it's important that you are able to visually distinct, right? Because, so let's say like you have low vision so you can kind of see it, and you have regular vision so you see it, right? It's important to be able to see that it's visually different, and that's why by default it's underlined in most places. Like when you automatically add a hyperlink, it becomes underlined, and then it becomes a blue color instead of the black, because that adds the contrast within the default black and white that's generally set up in Word and PowerPoint and all these other tools that we use for writing. So even though that visually distinct piece is not relevant to all disabilities, right, it's still important to have it because it still helps with the structure of the document. When we're linking things, we're advised to avoid saying click here and hyperlinking that, because we don't know how many click here's we're going to have in a document. So that's kind of like the web page situation. Do not remove the underline of a hyperlink, because again, it needs to be visually distinct. If you don't want to use the blue color that it automatically changes to when it's hyperlinked, you can change it to any color you want. You just have to make sure that it has a strong color contrast with the other colors that you're using. Right? So if you're already writing in blue and then it hyperlinks into blue and you want to change it, then change it to something that stands out against the blue so that it still stays visually distinct. And it's generally advised that we only use underlining in documents for hyperlinks just to stay consistent. Questions about hyperlinks? Does everyone know how to add and edit hyperlinks? All right. So the next piece we're going to talk about is contrast. And contrast gets a little complicated. And I'm going to share a link with you guys later. I forgot to put it in the PowerPoint, so I will add it. But when we come, contrast is the difference in the brightness level between the text and the background, right? And so when we're measuring that, we use something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? Which is very uncomfortably referred to as WCAG, which really sounds like someone just is making a weird sound, and I really don't like saying it, but here we are. So it has four main pieces to it. It has to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Right? So they go with the acronym of POUR. So when they say perceivable, it means that all users can receive and recognize the content regardless of their disability. For operable, it's that all users can navigate and interact with the document, content, and functionality, including links and embedded multimedia. Understandable means that users can interpret and process the information and the content within the document. So it should be readable, legible, comprehensible, and consistent. And finally, robust means that the content and functionality works with assistive technologies that are being used by people with disabilities who need them, right? It also means that it can be used later in the near future without any problems, right? It's just that consistency piece. So these four principles are, according to WCAG, I hate myself every time I say it. It feels so weird. I feel like I'm saying something wrong. Those establish a solid framework for accessibility when it comes to images. And so with that in mind, there are guidelines and success criteria for WCAG, and these are all linked to the POUR principles, right? And so these general goals kind of like work towards to ensure that you're maximizing accessibility as much as possible. And so what they mean by success criteria is that they're tests that measure the conformance with the guidelines. And so then here are the three levels for the success criteria. You have level A, level AA, and level AAA, which I enjoy because these are my initials. So I think they did it just for me. I feel like it's how they're apologizing for making me have to say WCAG so frequently. So if your document doesn't meet level A, then it can't meet level AA, right? They build upon each other, right? It's kind of like a scaffold. So in order to meet AA, you have to meet A, and to meet AAA, you have to meet AA and A, right? That kind of flows together. And that's why level A/AA are what is viewed as standard, right? The last level, the AAA level, is kind of perceived as an enhancement for users with disabilities, right? You don't have to implement it. It might actually be really difficult to implement them, or it just might not be relevant. So it's like, think of it as a premium feature, right? It's good if you can do it, but it's not necessary unless it's necessary, right? And then in which case it wouldn't be, sorry, my hair got in my eye. Yeah, so that last level is just like a cherry on top. It's a bonus feature, right? So because I messed this up. When you're working with WCAG, and this is going to be the website that I'm going to share with you in a moment, it requires a contrast of 4.5 to 1 or a 3 to 1 for large text, such as a big bold heading. And large text here is defined as 18 points or larger, or 14 and larger if it's bolded, right? And in order to do the color contrast test, we need the RBG values, right? So just before we move forward with this part, I'm going to summarize and let me know if you have any questions. When we are working on contrast, we have to make sure that, you know what, let me pause on that. So when we're talking in terms of, there's a minimum contrast and a maximum contrast. The maximum one is the traditional black text on, ooh, I messed that one up really badly. It's black text on a white background. Ignore what I have written there. I need to fix this. As you can tell, I was really very tired when I did that one and I did not proofread it well. And that will give us a ratio of 21 to 1. That is the maximum. And this is what it looks like here when we do it on the WebAIM website that I'm going to share with you, right? The foreground color, the text, is the black color, and this is its RBG value, and this is the background color, the white, and then this is the contrast, and then it passes all the levels. All right, and then the exact opposite of that would be black on black, white on white, blue on blue. It's going to give us the same thing. So if you have the same color background and text, then you get a 1-to-1 ratio where you fail everything, right? So I use the example of the black on black just because I like the way the screen looked, because I am weird like that and I enjoy weird things sometimes. I have no other reason for it. Yeah, it's if you put any color on itself, essentially you get a 1-to-1, which is a failure. So in summary, in order to provide sufficient contrast, you always start with a visual inspection, right? Because if you see black on black text or white on white text, you're like, oh, that doesn't look right. But also if you see like a light blue on a navy blue, you're also kind of like, yeah, that doesn't look like either. Like something is wrong there. So the visual inspection is really important. And then follow the contrast ratios that are defined in the WCAG level AA to measure content, right? And like here, even like at the bottom of these two, it gives us examples of the explanation of the foreground and the hexagon format, and it tells you how to do it, and then the lighter sides can be used to adjust. So what you can do here, and that's actually what I did with the flyer, and I'm going to show you how I did that. After I did the flyer, I screenshot it, and I turned it from into an image, and then I put it in the color wheel at Adobe, and then it gave me the RBG values, and I plugged the RBG values here, and the things that had failed, I moved these sliders to fix them and got then it would adjust and give me the new number here, and then I would go into the Canva that I was using and plugged in those numbers to make it accessible. So that's always a great way to do it. It's a little tedious, but again, it ensures accessibility, so it's always worthwhile. Do you have any questions so far?
Yes. So where do you get that contrast checker?
I will be sharing the link with you momentarily.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So this is the WebAIM contrast checker. Okay, let me share it with you right now so I don't forget. So there are multiple ones for it. This is the one that I generally use for it. So you just kind of, let right? So this is the link that I just sent you. So what you do is like you paste the number of your text here, the RBG value here, and of the background here, and then so if we do the Adobe color wheel, which is also the second link that I will show you. So this is the Adobe color wheel. Can you see the Adobe color wheel now? All right, perfect. So it has accessibility tools, so it kind of like will help with a bunch of things, but it has the extract theme and extract gradient. So what I do when I want to get a theme, which is what I did the with the flyer. So I think this was the first one that I had, right? And so I just moved these circles, oops, to the different pieces that I wanted. So like I got my navy blue, I got I got this one, and so I copied those into here. And then right, and it passes. Initially it wasn't that. Initially it was much lighter. So it was failing and this was darker. So it was essentially like that, right? So like if you have a color scheme that you like and you want to keep it, you just kind of play around like with the lightness of things here and kind of like play around with it until it passes. And then you copy those and then you put them into, so if you're doing this here like in PowerPoint, let me go back to this share. So like for example, if I want to change this, can you see my PowerPoint where I'm editing? All right. How about now? Can you see that? Fantastic. I love you're all muted and I can just see you from the side of my, like, kind of just kind of like that. Um, so you go into more colors and then based on the colors that I had, which were, do we remember? All right. So FFECDB. Can someone write that down? FFECDB. Right? So like now it's like this. We can't see it, right? But I did transfer the color, right? So like that's usually like how one would do it here. Right? Can you see presenter mode or the regular screen?
Just the
We see your
regular.
presentation.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
Wait, do you see the one with the notes on the side or just the full screen?
the full screen.
Full screen.
Okay, perfect. Let me know if I'm moving too fast. I tend to like super speak. Oh, perfect. All right, so the next piece then is color reliance. And the issue with color reliance is, well, color reliance is using hue, shade, tint, or tone as the only means of conveying content information. And the problem with that is some people can't see colors very well. And that's not an effective way of doing things, right? So imagine if you're someone who struggles with red and green, right? And I have my colors, like I have a list of something and it's like in red and green. And like red means one thing, green means one thing, and like purple means another. But you can't differentiate between the yellow and the green, the red and the green, because you can't see the difference between them, right? So relying on color is just generally not something that we promote. One of the examples that we always use is when people have on a slide a red stop button and a green go button, but they don't write the stop and the go. And then students have to choose the button, like which one to, and they don't know because they don't see the difference between them, right? So they look identical, so you don't really know what to do with it. And again, that's not really something that we would consider if we don't have that kind of thing to worry about, right? So it's until you've had a student say like, oh, but they look the same to me, you're like, huh, right? So it's best to like not put a student in that situation or put yourself in that situation, because it's just so easily avoidable, and it's just so much better to just make things accessible and just easier for everyone. Also, users that have low vision may end up having to use a lot of colors in your document to view them in a combination that works best for them. So when you over rely on color, you make that more difficult for people that need to do that, right? Because sometimes we use color schemes that work for us, but would not work well for someone who has low vision, and then they end up having to make adjustments, which is not ideal because we don't want them to have to do more work to get to where they want to go. We're supposed to have already done that for them, right? We're not supposed to be giving them more work unnecessarily. So instead of relying on color, or at least instead of solely relying on color, different things can be done. For example, text styling, right? Bold or italics. That's a good way to differentiate important content information, right? Um, I will also point out that screen reader softwares do not typically identify styled text any differently. So whether it's in a different color or styled, that means very little to a screen reader, right? So in that regard, we generally promote avoiding color reliance by separating your content, providing text labels, and using icons if you're going to be using color differentiation, right? Like a word or a check or like some kind of icon to help the student know what is like that this is a different color. Or like these are the reds have this next to them, the greens have this next to them, and the grays have that next to them, right? So that would be an important way for doing it. In terms of also not differentiating based on color, one of the things that we recommend, especially when we're using charts and graphs, is to use labels, patterns, the way we order things, as well as text alternatives, which are the previously mentioned data tables that I had talked about during complex images. Questions?
Can
All
you
right.
explain the icon thing a little bit?
So an icon would be kind of like this image right here, the check with like just a little image accompanying a text. One of the ones that I saw that I liked was someone was talking, I think they were talking about like different types of snakes, and some are they're venomous and some that aren't. And so they had them labeled like the color coded, where the poisonous were red and the non-poisonous were green. And because it was made into an accessible document, they had that poison icon, like the skull with the bones, next to the reds, so that those who can't see them can see the icon and know that those are poisonous. Right, so
Okay,
it's,
thank you.
does that help?
Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, those are the things that we kind of like to promote. So now we're moving on to document structure. And here we're going to talk about headings, tables, a bunch of other fun stuff. So document structure is really, really important because especially longer documents, we tend to scan through things. So when we use proper structure for it, the headings and the subheadings function in a way that then help us have a better understanding of what is what and what we're getting into, and just kind of acts like an outline a little bit. And also, um, so it's kind of like how sighted users look at headings for like descriptions of content. They also might rely on the headings, the appearance of the headings to kind of pinpoint what's a main heading and what's a subheading and like what's general text. Um, and this is kind of what proper headings and documents do for screen readers. Um, it's actually the most common way that screen readers scan a document is by headings and subheadings. So it's really, really important that we don't skip a heading. Like so, like if your document title is in a heading, then you start with a heading 1, a heading 2, a heading 3. You don't jump from a 2 to a 4, because then that messes up the organization of the screen reader, right? Like I said, so it's essential for screen readers. And then, as we all know, we have different headings, and where we have the main heading, the major subheadings, the major headings, and then the subheadings. So, as I said, headings should clearly and succinctly describe the section of the content, and the structure of the hierarchy of headings in a document is very important for accessibility, because kind of that's also how the screen reader skims through it kind of and scans it. So main headings are usually the most common one that we all use, because that's, well, we're expected to use, because that's like the bold text that describes the entire document, which is essentially the title, right? And then the major headings and subheadings are like headings 2 and 3 and anything that follows. And again, heading 2 is describing the major section in a document after, like, because it's right under the so like for this presentation, right, the main heading is accessible documents. The first heading was overview, and then we went into three little pieces in the overview, and then we went into document content, where we spoke about images, hyperlinks, color, contrast, right? And then now we're in structure, where we're talking about headings and different other pieces, right? And so heading 2 is a major section, heading 3 is a subsection of heading 2, heading 4 is a subsection of heading 3, and so on. And like I said, you should never, never, ever, ever skip a heading, because it is how screen readers read the documents. Also, it just helps when you kind of, if you're putting a table of contents later, it's much easier to do it automatically if you already have the headings correctly, because it often will be generated automatically on Word, on things like that, if you know how to do it. If you don't, absolutely show you that at the end. Questions about headings? Fantastic. All right, so lists and tables are our next thing. I'm not going to go into too much detail about lists, because it's pretty straightforward, and I'm happy to talk more about it to anyone who wants me to later on. But essentially, when we're using lists, we have two types of lists. We can either use bullets or we can use numbers. We use bullets only when there is no hierarchy or specific order for things, and we use numbers only when there's a specific order. If we use bullets with something that has a specific order, then the screen reader doesn't capture that, because it doesn't say 1, 2, or 3, right? So if you're studying something that is a process, and it's like step 1, step 2, step 3, you have to use a number list, because then if you don't and you use bullets, it's just going to read from 1 to 2 to 3 without differentiation. So then the person listening to it is going to be incredibly confused as to how that is a process, right? Like imagine if you're like trying to follow a recipe, but it's not telling you the steps, it's just like blending everything together. That's going to make for a really weird meal, right? So that's really all I have to say about bullets and numbers, because I think that's the most important piece, and I think other than that, it's pretty straightforward. But again, if anyone has any questions about that, I'm happy to address it later. Now, columns, not something we use often. However, if we do use them, we have to use it through the built-in setting features in whatever tool we're using to create our document. Because if we use like tabs and spaces, then it will read it across, not in the column. So when we use the built-in feature of creating column, it's actually just going to go down the column and read it normally. And I don't know if you can see my hand in what I'm doing. I'm assuming that maybe some of you can see me, or I'm just gesticulating to myself. Who knows? But so again, if we have to use the built-in feature of creating a column just so that it works out properly. All right, because then other than that, screen readers won't read it correctly, and it'll read the first line from this column, the first line from this column, second line from the first column, second line from the second column, and it ends up being very, very confusing. Again, potentially leading to an incredibly, incredibly weird meal. Now, tables. Tables are one thing that almost always get flagged for me, and I didn't understand why, and I recently did, and I was very, very proud of myself. First of all, tables are read in a specific way, right? It's a grid. They're scanned vertically, well, vertically and horizontally. So screen readers can interact with the table by either moving horizontally and vertically through the cells, and that's why we need to have proper headings for tables. And here's an example of a table from my dissertation that I struggled with, like I cannot even explain, right? And I eventually realized, all right, oh, can you see the table again? Right, okay, so I'm going to go and show you how to do the accessibility piece for a PDF. So you go into info and then you go for to check for issues and you choose check accessibility, right? And as I said earlier, I left a bunch of things on purpose so that if we had time, we can go through it together. But what I really wanted to show you was here. When I click on the table and I go into layout, table design, there we go. I have header row checked off. If I remove that, then it's going to tell me that I have an error that my table doesn't have a header, right? And so you put it back. And then the same thing happens in Word documents, where if your table is going through multiple pages, you have to click the option that says repeat header row, so that when it moves to a new page, the new header, the same header is still there, so that whoever is looking at it does not get confused as to what the headers were and have to keep like scanning back and forth. Have you ever had to go through like a table that was like 7,000 pages long and you had to keep like going back to see what each column was? So that's essentially avoiding that, right? It's just a little click. I think the way to get it from Mac on Word on Mac is a little different from how you get it on PC Word, but it's and like I think also like I know Pages has a different way of doing it, but it's always going to be there, right? It's one of those like fundamental accessibility pieces, right? So it's just one of those things that you just have to make sure you click it. It is so important. No one wants to go through, whether or not you have a disability, you don't want to go through a table that is multiple pages and have to try to remember what the headings were. So to check document accessibility is our last piece, I believe, I hope, because we have 5 minutes left. Essentially, we get warnings. So I just showed you how to do it on PowerPoint very quickly, right? It's the same process for Word. Exact same thing. And then you're going to get the column on the side with all the things, and you click on them and you address them, and it's perfectly fine, right? So I'm going to do it again. Info, inspect, check accessibility. All right, so here we can see this is a decorative image, right? But it's not marked. It's marked as missing alternative text. So what I can do is I can click the thingy here and I can mark it as decorative and it magically goes away. And then content placeholder. So I'm also going to mark that as decorative and it magically goes away because it's decorative. Now this is also decorative. It doesn't really add any value to the thing on the slide, right? So it's decorative. So right? So as you can see, we have three kinds of, now that I can see them all on the same sheet, we can, they're either going to tell us errors, warnings, and tips. Those are the three kinds of things that they show us. An error is basically content that makes a document difficult to read and understand, and those absolutely must be addressed. Okay? A warning is something that in most cases can make the document difficult to understand, but not always. So an example of that could be a table that has split cells. That's confusing for a screen reader, so it's marked as a warning. And then a tip ends up being something that's not really necessarily an issue, but could be presented in a different way that makes the user's experience better, right? So I had one of those here. For the WCAG slide, right? Like you can see here, this one's like web aim color contrast checker, and then web aim color contrast checker. So like that is actually, yep, see, duplicated slide. I have two slides with the same name, so that's a tip. Like I should change that, right? So like I said, I left some things on purpose so that you can kind of see that it's a process and no one ever gets it right from the first go around. And so essentially, like the important thing to remember here, and also like I don't have like for these pictures, I don't have alternative text. So like I would have to like add descriptive text, and I would put like add description, right, like here, and then edit to add alternative text, and like here, see like the description that's automatically generated that I said was going to be really bad is graphical user interface application, which is not at all helpful, right? Whereas here what we could write is no contrast, right? Oh, wow, I cannot spell today. So no contrast screen grab, right? Like a web aim screen grab or whatever, right? And then click enter, and then close that, and then it's no longer here, right? So the thing is, the accessibility checker that's built into Word and PowerPoint and all that fun stuff identifies a lot of things, but there's still other issues that it cannot detect. So you always have to go through them carefully and make sure that you got everything that you think it needs. But it's also good to have a manual checklist to make sure some of these things are fine. I was gonna add some stuff about PowerPoint here, but I realized it was never gonna be enough time to do all of that. But we can do a separate PowerPoint one, and there's also like a lot more stuff for Excel. So there was just no way that we're gonna be able to do everything together in one day.
This is awesome, Alia. This is so much. I mean, I didn't know about hardly any of this. Yeah, thank you. There were a couple questions. I know we're at the end, but a couple questions on social media tips for those types of posts.
Mm-hmm.
If you had any tips for, like, we have Instagram, Twitter.
I mean, they're pretty concise, so I've never thought about it in terms of Instagram and Twitter. Because like Twitter's what was 140 characters, now it's like 200 and something.
Yeah, I had someone tell me if I post a picture with words on it, I should always write them out in the tweet or like in a subtweet or something like that.
That makes sense to me. Because you can't exactly add alternative text and image on that, so that absolutely makes sense to me.
And then I also heard if you're doing a hashtag, you should capitalize each word because then a screen reader can read it. But if they're all lowercase, it won't read it right.
Oh, I've not heard that one.
That was something I saw on Twitter.
That is interesting. I'm gonna have to research that. I've not heard of that. I've honestly, like, I've been so focused on documents because we've been one of the things that I've been working on for the past year is making sure that the documents we have on our like Blackboard and LMS system for our students in our classes, especially when COVID happened, that everything is accessible. So I've been mostly working on PDFs, PowerPoints, Word documents, and Excels, just to make those accessible. So I've not really given much thought to social media, mostly because I'm not that big on using social media. So it's just one of those things that I just would have never even considered had you not mentioned it today.
This has been great. Alia, I know if some people have to go, I know our time is up, but I don't know if you need to go as well, Alia. I had a quick question, but if people need
Yeah,
to
sure.
go.
No, you're good. I'm done for the day.
My only question, I mean, this was great, and I'm going to rewatch, and we'll definitely send out the recording as well, because there are so many good tools and tips and tricks here. I was just wondering if there's any resource for like recommended color contrasts that would meet the criteria, or if in general you kind of just have to play with it.
Yes, let me pull that up. So this is one of the sites that I like. Um, this gives you the information of the brightness and stuff in a way that does not make sense to me. Maybe it'll make sense to someone else. Just to me, it looks like it's written like code and math, which confuses me. So I avoid it because I like my letters, not with numbers. Um,
Hmm.
and I already sent you the color checker. And in the color checker, they have a bunch of resources like that WebAIM site. They have like articles and just resources and everything. And I think they also have this page that I really like.
Maybe we can compile these too and send them
Yeah,
out.
I can add them. And then there's some of like the Microsoft resources of just how to do it for PowerPoint and Word and stuff. And again, like there's also like to do all of that in PDF is very, very different, and it has a completely different way of like optimizing and stuff. So that like I know we had said we're gonna do PDF today, but it just ended up being its own monster, and there was no way I was gonna fit it in. So
Yeah,
I'd rather just avoid it
That's
instead of
okay.
half-assing it.
no,
Yeah.
we'll have to do a part two then.
Looks like we must, yes. Yeah.
Yes, please do it. It is so much of help. I maybe I was waiting for this for a long time.
Well,
And
I'm happy you found it helpful. I felt like I was speeding through, and because I couldn't see you guys, I thought that I was not getting anything across, and I was just kind of I felt very much like I was speaking to myself. So I'm kind of relieved that you guys found it helpful.
I just want to ask you, what did you talk about the column? Like when you said like you have to, like, is there anything can you show? Like how you do the column?
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna share something from my my dissertation because it's also not the document that I'm working with, so it would help. That's okay if I make changes to it because it's not necessary. I have a new one. Uh, all right, can you see my whatever this is?
Yes.
All right. So let me get to a place that doesn't have so many. 1 second, please. All right, there we go. So sometimes when people want to make a column, I honestly don't know how people do it incorrectly because I feel like that's very tedious to have to do it like separately in spaces and like write a little bit and then space it out and then like write a little, and I don't understand how you can do that in an odd way, but apparently it's possible. That's why it's part of the thing. But like if I want to like take those 2 paragraphs and turn them into a column, I will go into layout and I will go under columns and I'll specify that I want it in 2 columns, right? That way when the screen reader is reading, it's going to read an explanatory sequential method, mixed method design is implemented, and it's gonna read down the column, and then when it's done with this column, it's gonna go to this column. Whereas apparently sometimes people try to format it without this, without it being, some people try to do it manually, is what makes it a problem, which feels tedious and a waste of time to me as someone who's lazy and likes having a quick fix to things so I can spend more time doing other things that I like. Right? But yeah, so just however many columns you want it to be in, you just go under design, under layout, and then you decide how many columns you want, right? And then yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're
Yes,
welcome.
thank you.